Engamana engareo ingatawira pumanawa ro rakatidama tenakoto tenatato katoa. My name is Harleen Hain, and I have the great privilege of being the Vice Chancellor here at the University of Otago. And on behalf of the university, I would like to warmly welcome each and every one of you to this inaugural professorial lecture for Professor Greg Dawes. As I look out on the audience this evening, I see staff and students from all of the academic divisions here at the University of Otago, and I also see members of the general public, and all of you are extraordinarily welcome to be here this evening. But I'd also like to extend a particular welcome to the members of Greg's family who are here to support him. His wife, Kristen, is here, and his daughters, Anna and Kitty. So we would like to, on behalf of the university, particularly welcome you to this fantastic celebration. And that's really what we are all here to do. As an academic or Dunedin community, we are all here to join in the celebration of the promotion of Professor Greg Dawes. Now, as I often say at the beginning of these lectures, promotion to the rank of professor at the University of Otago is no easy feat. In order to achieve this academic rank, a candidate must excel in teaching, in research, and in service to not only Otago, but also to their professional community. Now, Greg has more than exceeded our expectations in all three of these areas. Now, in addition to making our own assessments about a candidate's suitability for the promotion to professor, during the course of the promotion process, we also seek the advice of national and international experts on the significance of the candidate's work. Now, when we sought this feedback for Greg, we heard things like, Greg Dawes has made unique contributions to epistemology and to the philosophy of science, religious studies, and the philosophy of religion. We also heard, Greg is very highly regarded by his peers in the philosophy of religion. His background in religious studies means not only that he has a greater capacity to engage in interdisciplinary conversation than most philosophers of religion, but also that he is able to speak with authority on topics about which many philosophers of religion are inadequately informed. And finally, another assessor told us, I am regularly asked to make assessments of applicants for promotion to full professor. I can say without hesitation that Professor Dawes' application and supporting documents constitute a case that meets the very highest standards. Now, on a personal note, I would like to acknowledge two additional things about Greg. His books have received numerous accolades and positive reviews, and he holds not one, but 2 PhDs. For that alone, we probably should have promoted him. So, Professor Dawes, on behalf of the University of Otago, I would like to warmly congratulate you on your very well-deserved promotion to the rank of professor. And I will now call on Professor Tony Ballantyne, the Pro-Vice Chancellor of Humanities, to tell us just a little bit more about Greg's journey to professor. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa.
Tēnā koutou katoa. It is my great pleasure to introduce Professor Greg Dawes, who holds a joint appointment between the Department of Philosophy and the Department of Theology and Religion. It is fantastic that you've all joined us this evening to celebrate Greg's promotion to professor. Born and raised in Dunedin, Greg spent his formative years in the southern part of the city, in Tainui, not a part of the city known for breeding philosophers. But still, he was educated at St. Paul's High School, which of course now is Kavanagh College. After a couple of years in Christchurch, he undertook a Bachelor of Theology degree while studying at Holy Cross College before being ordained. After several years in Invercargill, he headed off to Rome to complete a biblical studies qualification at the Pontifical Biblical Institute. On completing that training, he returned and taught at Holy Cross for a time before leaving the priesthood. Greg's pathway in terms of his training is extremely impressive. He is extremely well trained. In addition to his qualification from Rome, he also completed his first Otago PhD in biblical studies. Greg then worked as a teaching fellow in biblical studies before obtaining a lecturing position in the religious studies program here at Otago. At that time, of course, that was separate from theology. But when he found, as he puts it, that every course he taught was turning into a philosophy course, he thought he should get a proper qualification in that field. So he completed a second PhD in philosophy, and he was very lucky, of course, to do that at Otago with an incredible philosophy department and under the guidance of Professor Alan Musgrave. So that's the second PhD. This led in due course to a joint appointment between the two programs, philosophy and religion. Although Greg's first book was a straight biblical studies monograph, his research since then has focused on the interaction between scientific modes of thought and those characteristic of religion. This led to a book on the historical Jesus debate, which examined the impact of historical thinking on traditional religious claims. His philosophy PhD compared theistic explanations, those that appealed to divine action, with the kinds of explanations offered in the sciences. This too was published as Theism and Explanation. Last year, he published not one book, but two. One was on the Galileo affair, arguing that religious and scientific communities exhibit very different and often incompatible attitudes to knowledge. And the second was on the reshaping of the philosophy of religion, to give it a broader focus, both in terms of the questions it asks and the religion it covers. And it's that kind of broad, ambitious program that some of the referees' comments refer to. In tonight's lecture, Greg is going to give us a taste of his current work on ancient and medieval empiricism. So I'm very happy to pass over to Greg, who's going to speak to us on Out of the Myths.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Harleen and Tony, for the very generous introductions. I would like to begin with some more formal words of thanks. These are due, first of all, to Kristen. Ever since I had that fairly major change of career about 25 years ago, one that brought us together, she's been unwaveringly supportive of my work. Being a medical person, she did some years ago diagnose my condition as an obsessive need-to-know disorder. But I'm happy to say she's made no attempt to cure it. My children, Anna and Kitty, belong to an exclusive group of philosophers' kids living up in Roslyn. They may regard this as a mixed blessing, but what I appreciate is that they've actually become serious conversation partners. Our dinner time conversations often take a philosophical turn, and a recent debate with Kitty regarding free will and determinism was as challenging in some ways as a meeting of the philosophy seminar. Speaking of the philosophy seminar, I should also thank the members of the department who welcomed me some years ago when I arrived on their doorstep as an intellectual refugee. Since joining the philosophers, I've often felt like the slow child in the top class, but that's not a bad place to be. One person to whom I owe a special debt is Alan Musgrave. It was 21 years ago when I first visited the philosophy department, then on the 5th floor of the Burns building, with a draft copy of an article on theology and religious studies. I had shamelessly borrowed a number of ideas from the philosophy of science, and since I wasn't trained as a philosopher, I thought I should check them out. So I visited Alan. I came away, of course, with a polite suggestion that I had bought into some fallacious ideas and a big pile of reading to do. The article was eventually published, and since then, Alan has been both mentor and friend. Alan, as many of you will know, studied at the London School of Economics with one of the greatest philosophers of science, Karl Popper. Since Alan later acted as my PhD supervisor, I've always considered myself one of Popper's intellectual grandchildren. So it seems appropriate that I should today revisit a suggestion made by Popper about the birth of philosophy. Now, I need to be really careful talking about the birth of philosophy. The philosophy I'm discussing is that which originated in ancient Greece. I am not suggesting this is the only tradition of philosophy. It's not. The Greeks were not the only people to reflect on what exists, how we should act, and how we could know what we think we know. Karl Jaspers famously suggested that there was an axial age in human thought between 800 and 200 BC, in which philosophical reflection began in a variety of cultures: China, India, Iran, Palestine, and Greece. I'm not convinced that philosophy arose independently of the Greeks in Palestine or Iran, but it does seem to have arisen in China and India at the same time as it was arising in Greece. My colleagues in the religion program, Will Sweetman and Ben Chantal, there's Ben, could tell you about Indian and Buddhist philosophy. Ben, I'm happy to say, is a former student of mine, and another former student, Cheryl Cartine, there's Cheryl, is visiting at the moment, has gone on to study Confucian philosophy. I'm a proud teacher as well as a proud father. But about those traditions of philosophy, I have nothing to say. I do, however, have something to say about the philosophy of ancient Greece. What I want to ask is where this tradition of philosophy came from and how it differed from what went before. Now, there's an answer to this question that dates back to Aristotle. Aristotle distinguished between the earliest philosophers and those who spoke mythically, writing about the gods. In his Metaphysics, we read, "The school of Hesiod and all the theologians thought only of what was plausible to themselves. But into the subtleties of those who spoke mythically, it's not worth our while to inquire seriously. Those, however, who use the language of proof, we must cross-examine." Now, those of you who know me won't be surprised that I rather like this contrast between those who tell apparently unfounded stories about the gods and those who use the language of proof. It represents a distinction between myth and reason, mythos and logos. Religious thinkers are inclined to regard a contrast of this kind as modern and to blame it on the so-called Enlightenment of the 17th and 18th centuries, but it's much older, as we've just seen. It's also currently unfashionable. Classical scholars have pointed out that distinctions of Aristotle's kind were used for polemical purposes. They were used by philosophers, like Aristotle, to stake a claim to novelty and seriousness. They were also used by the earliest medical writers who strove to establish their own credentials by disparaging alternative practitioners. The battle between scientific and alternative forms of medicine is not new. The author known as Hippocrates, for example, distinguishes his view of medicine from that of the magicians, purifiers, charlatans, and quacks who employ ritual cures. The problem here is that the methods of Hippocratic physicians at least overlapped those of many of the ritual healers. Both, for example, prescribed abstention from certain foods, sometimes the same foods. And, as we'll see in a moment, the earliest philosophy was closer to myth than a casual reader of Aristotle would be led to believe. So the use of this ancient distinction between myth and reason is not unproblematic, nor is it innocent. It serves purposes other than intellectual. Now, many scholars in the humanities would regard this as a reason to cease using the distinction and to focus instead on the relations of power its use exhibits. It's not the relation of myth and reason we should be studying, such people would say, but the way the terms myth and reason have been used. Well, one can, of course, take that line, but it doesn't follow from the fact that a distinction has been used to defend someone's turf that it's a spurious one. This one, I want to argue, is not. There is a real distinction between myth and reason, which is reflected in our later distinctions between religion and science, theology and philosophy. Now, to understand what lies behind these distinctions, A good place to start is with the Pre-Socratic philosophers. Thinkers such as Thales, Anaximander, and Anaximenes, Parmenides, Empedocles, Anaxagoras, and Democritus. What cool names, don't you think? Great names for cats. Actually, my children should count themselves lucky. I wasn't studying ancient philosophy when they were born. They may have ended up being named Xanthippe and Pythagoras after the, no doubt, long-suffering wives of Socrates and Aristotle, respectively. Now, I mentioned a suggestion a moment ago made by Karl Popper about the birth of philosophy. He too assumed a distinction between myth and philosophy, but he argued that philosophy emerged from myth and its earliest materials were mythic in form. It's that idea I want to pursue. Popper, I think, was more correct than he knew. The earliest philosophy was more deeply rooted in myth than he thought. But Aristotle was also right to claim that even the earliest forms of philosophy differed from the mythology on which it drew. So what was the kinship between the earliest philosophy and myth? I'll approach that question by asking three more. What were the questions the Pre-Socratics were addressing? What kinds of answers did they give? And with what authority did they speak? Let's start with the questions. The earliest Pre-Socratics were the Ionians, a group of thinkers based in around Miletus on the western coast of Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey. Three of these, Thales, Anaximander, and Anaximenes, are traditionally regarded as the founders of science. They were, in the words of a later commentator, those who first revealed the investigation of nature to the Greeks. But their investigation of nature took a very distinctive form. They did not carefully observe and catalogue the natural world. Aristotle would later do that, but the Pre-Socratics did not. Nor did they carry out experiments. Experiment was never a prominent feature of Greek science, although we find related practices in the dissections carried out by medical writers, the use of instruments by astronomers, and experiments in harmony carried out by those who studied music. The Pre-Socratics, however, were not careful observers or experimenters. They were bold speculators. And the questions about which they speculated were, firstly, what is the fundamental substance out of which all things are made? And secondly, how did the cosmos, the ordered world we can observe, come into existence? Indeed, quite a number of them offered more or less detailed cosmogonies, as they're called, accounts of the origin of the universe. Now, this may seem perfectly reasonable. After all, modern physics also offers us a theory of the origin of the universe, the so-called Big Bang theory. I understand that theory is increasingly contested, but it has some evidential support. At the time of the Pre-Socratics, however, the idea that the world had a beginning was entirely without evidential support. There was nothing in the appearance of nature to suggest that the world order was not eternal. Indeed, Parmenides would argue that it was, denying that the world could have a beginning. For very different reasons, Aristotle would also claim that the world had neither beginning nor end, a view that seemed plausible for many centuries to come. Despite this fact, a number of the Pre-Socratics did speak about a cosmogony, a beginning of the universe. So where did this idea come from? It came, I think, from the world of myth. The poet Hesiod had, in the 8th or early 7th century BC, set out an account of the origins of the world in terms of the birth of the gods, a cosmogony which was also a theogony. Here it is, or the beginnings of it. In the beginning, there was only chaos, the abyss. But then Gaia, the earth, came into being. her broad bosom the ever-firm foundation of all, and Tartaros, dim in the underground depths, and Eros, loveliest of the immortals, who makes their bodies and men's bodies go limp. The Greeks were strong on Eros, mastering their minds and subduing their wills. Now, in these opening lines, the myth is already partly rationalized. The names of the deities are little more than symbols of this worldly realities. Later in the poem, however, the gods become more clearly gods, indeed gods behaving badly, to the great scandal of writers such as Xenophanes and Plato. Here is an image of a god behaving badly, Kronos castrating his father Uranos with a sickle. In any case, the stories found in Hesiod are not the only stories, not the only myths to speak of the origins of the world. Lots of myths speak of origins. We have, of course, our own story of Rangi and Papa, as well as the opening chapters of Genesis. But perhaps the most famous in the ancient world is the Babylonian myth, known from its opening words as the Enuma Elish. When on high the heaven had not been named, firm ground below had not been called by name, nothing but primordial Apsu, their begetter, and Mumu Tiamat, she who bore them all, their waters commingling as a single body. No reed hut had been mattered, no marshland had appeared, when no gods whatever had been brought into being, uncalled by name, their destinies undetermined, then it was the gods were formed within them. The earliest philosophers, when writing about the beginnings of the world, in fact, to have the very idea of a beginning of the world, were drawing on a collection of mythic themes, both from their own traditions and from that of their neighbours. These shaped the kinds of questions they asked. They also shaped the kind of answers they gave, for often these too came from the world of myth. Take, for example, the idea attributed to Thales, that the earth rests on water. In Egypt, the earth was commonly thought of as a flat dish resting on the waters, an idea also found in the Hebrew Bible, where God is said to have spread out the earth upon the waters. In the Babylonian story, too, Apsu and Tiamat represent fresh and salt water respectively, and it's they from whom all other beings arise. So there seems a fairly direct line from Egyptian and Babylonian myth to the earliest physics. More interesting still is the cosmogony of Anaximander. In his sayings, the substance out of which everything has come into being has become more abstract, being the indefinite. The world comes into existence by way of a separating out of contrasting qualities, such as the hot and the cold, the moist and the dry. Once separated out, these qualities again combine, giving rise to individual living things. Now, that story is also mythic in form. It follows the same pattern as Hesiod's story, in which chaos, the undifferentiated chaos, gives rise to the couples Erebos, the god of darkness and night, who in turn give birth to Aether, the bright sky and day. The union of earth and heaven gives rise in turn to other gods. Here too, the primary undifferentiated reality out of which contrasting pairs are separated, these contrasting pairs later reunite to give rise to the world we know. Now, mythic ideas are also found in the cosmologies offered by other pre-Socratics. According to one report, Heraclitus held that the heavenly bodies consisted of fire in solid bowls, the occasional turning of the bowls resulting in eclipses and phases of the moon. If he did say this, it reflects the ancient idea that Helios, the sun, sails each night in a golden bowl from west to east around the northern stream of Okeanos, the ocean around the earth. The same idea is found in Egyptian myth, where the sun was thought of as traveling from west to east in a boat across the subterranean waters. The work of Parmenides consists of a long poem. Its cosmology, its picture of the universe, also resembles that found in Hesiod. beginning with its depiction of the daughters of the sun emerging from the house of night. So not only the questions the pre-Socratics asked, but also some of the answers they gave were drawn from myth. But my third question is, with what authority did the pre-Socratics speak? Well, there is little of the attitude of the cautious scientist in many of the pre-Socratics' pronouncements. Empedocles, for instance, was not only a philosopher, he was also an orator, poet, politician, healer, and charismatic seer, who, in the words of one modern writer, pranced around Sicily, performing miraculous cures to adoring crowds. At one point, he refers to himself as an immortal god, albeit an exiled one, condemned to a cycle of rebirth because of his misdeeds. In previous lives, he tells us, he had been a boy and a girl, a bird and a bush, and a dumb fish of the sea. Now, imagine what would happen to any philosopher at Otago who made those kind of claims. Similar remarks may be made about the other pre-Socratics. Parmenides begins his poem with the tale of a journey to an otherworldly realm where he meets a goddess who reveals a truth beyond the comprehension of mere mortals. Empedocles also speaks of a journey to the world of the dead to bring back the soul of one who has died. Stories of this kind led three of the greatest classical scholars of the 20th century to compare these figures with the shamans if you prefer, of Siberian tradition. Indeed, one goes so far as to suggest a geographical connection through the Central Asian people, the Scythians. So, which is the more accurate picture of an early philosopher, the upper image or the lower one? The lower image, I'm told, is the first depiction of a Siberian shaman by a Western writer, although it's not clear if he ever saw one. Sadly, most scholars today consider the shaman hypothesis overstated because there's no independent evidence of shamanic practices in Greek society. Damn. It's sad because an IPL entitled Philosophy and Shamanism would have been irresistible and would have nicely brought together the two programs in which I work, philosophy and religion. But even if they're not shamans, strictly speaking, a number of the pre-Socratics seem to have presented themselves as divinely inspired figures, if not divine persons in their own right. Pythagoras, remember Pythagoras? Pythagoras, for instance, best known today for a geometrical theorem he may or may not have discovered, appears in the earlier sources as a divine figure, a manifestation of Apollo, and a bringer of a sacred revelation, who also taught reincarnation and founded a mystical cult. There's even a story of Pythagoras faking a journey to the underworld by hiding out in a cellar under his house. Here it is. Having arrived in Italy, he built a little underground room and instructed his mother to write down events as they happened, recording the time, and to keep passing these notes to him until he came back up. His mother did this, and after some time, Pythagoras came up thin as a skeleton, who went into the assembly and announced he had just returned from Hades. What's more, he read off to them an account of what happened in his absence. Taken in by his words, they wept and moaned and were sure he was some kind of divinity, so they even entrusted their wives to him, thinking they too would learn something from him. Now, this is mockery, of course, and it's mockery from a fairly late writer, but there's reason to think it actually reflects early Pythagorean traditions about Pythagoras' mystical powers. Okay. If these were the earliest philosophers, what does that tell us? Is there no difference between the world of philosophy and that of religion and myth? I did, after all, set out to defend the distinction, even if I appear to have just undermined it. If logos did emerge from mythos, reason from myth, we shouldn't forget how slow and painful was the process by which it came to birth. But even in the Pre-Socratics, we find traces of new attitudes, which will become characteristic of both philosophy and the sciences. The sciences, of course, just being late offshoots of philosophy. A first such feature of pre-Socratic thought consists in something we take for granted. Their ideas are attributed to individuals. For all that these individuals may have claimed a quasi-divine authority, they were individuals, named individuals whose views could be accepted or rejected. They certainly rejected each other's views. Anaximenes, for instance, held that the earth rests not on water, but on air. This wasn't just a response to Thales, it was a response to his predecessor Anaximander's idea that the earth rests on what philosophers would call the principle of sufficient reason. Since there's no reason for the earth to move one way or another, Anaximander had claimed it remains stationary in the middle of the cosmos. Anaximenes seemed to think that was no explanation at all. In a similar way, Heraclitus is quick to dismiss his predecessors. Great learning does not teach sense, for otherwise it would have taught Hesiod and Pythagoras, and again Xenophanes and Hecataeus. It's nasty, but as one writer puts it, it's unmistakably the sound of an intellectual at work. At your great learning does not teach sense. I sometimes think, especially if you left it in the original Greek, it might make a good university motto. Myths, by way of contrast, are not thought of in this way. Myths are not regarded as the creation of individuals with whom you can agree or disagree. In societies in which myths are taken seriously, they're not up for discussion. Often they are thought of as not coming from human beings, a phrase used by Indian thinkers of the Vedas. Some Australian Aboriginal people, for instance, claim that their rock art containing images of mythological figures wasn't created by human beings, but dates from the time of the dreaming. If myths do have an author, that author is divine, not human. This means that while the myths may be reinterpreted, as many Christians today reinterpret Genesis, they can't be rejected. Even the Greeks, who became very critical of their myths, didn't abandon the stories of the gods found in Hesiod and Homer. They kept them but read them as allegories in order to give them a more acceptable meaning. In this respect, the earliest philosophy did differ from myth. It was attributed to named individuals, and the doctrines they taught were contested from the very beginning. Excuse me. Now, I'm tempted to say that a second feature of pre-Socratic thought is a search for natural explanations of observable phenomena, but that will be too quick. What we find emerging in the pre-Socratics is the very idea of nature, the very idea of a natural world capable of being distinguished from that of the gods. This isn't a scientific discovery, it's an idea without which there would be no science. The pre-Socratics seem to have been among the first to think of the world as a cosmos, an ordered system of causes and principles that could be thought to operate on its own terms. It's only in the light of that idea that the phrase natural explanation has any meaning. Given that distinction, however, we can say that the pre-Socratics began offering natural explanations. Thales, for instance, explained earthquakes as a result of the movement of the water on which the earth rests. He no longer attributes them to the action of the god Poseidon. What this means is while the patterns of explanation employed by the pre-Socratics may be derived from myth, the elements of their explanations are not. It may not be very helpful to invoke the hot and the cold, the moist and the dry as the basic elements of the world, but these are natural properties whose operations can be verified by means of observation. There's much discussion today regarding the naturalism of the sciences, the fact they don't invoke God or the gods. Well, this is where it begins. This doesn't, by the way, mean that divinity was banished from the world. Democritus may have been an outright materialist and atheist, but most of the pre-Socratics were not. They still made reference to some divine reality or principle. Thales, indeed, is supposed to have said that all things are full of gods. But the pre-Socratics' new conception of the world went hand in hand with the new conception of the divine. Not only were particular phenomena not explained by referring to the actions of the gods, but the gods themselves were no longer depicted as personal agents who intervened in earthly affairs. That's most explicit in the work of Xenophanes, but the other pre-Socratics too, if they did speak of the divine, tended to present it as simply the ruling principle of an orderly universe. A final new feature of the pre-Socratics' thought is that not all their pronouncements took the form of dogmatic assertions or alleged divine revelations. They also began to engage in reasoned argument. Heraclitus, while speaking with the authority of a divinely inspired seer, still calls on his hearers to pay attention not to him, but to the logos, the underlying structure or plan of the world. Anaximander didn't just assert that the earth was suspended in the midst of the cosmos, but produced an argument for this view. Parmenides didn't just appeal to the authority of his goddess, but used arguments, albeit condensed and enigmatic arguments, in support of his ideas. Parmenides did speak of a revelation from a goddess, but it was a goddess who told him to judge by means of reason the much contested proof she was offering. Now, there's a contrast here between reason and sense perception, but the call to judge by means of reason is itself significant. The gods of traditional religions do not invite you to judge for yourself if their words are true. In the formulation of such arguments, the mythic forms of thought on which the pre-Socratics drew were gradually becoming something else. To borrow a phrase from Francis Cornford, they were becoming not just a search for wisdom, but a search for wisdom that could give an account of itself under critical examination. A search for wisdom that could give an account of itself under critical examination. That's not a bad description of what philosophy aspires to be. Yes, philosophy has its roots in myth, and in its earliest forms and practitioners was shaped by myth, but philosophy eventually emerged from the myths. Mythos did become logos. Myth did become reason. I might add that this parallels my own progression from theology to philosophy, but that's a story for another day. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Greg. I think Greg's lecture has introduced us to some of his current ideas and a set of arguments that have drawn upon his very distinctive intellectual trajectory through two different disciplines. He suggested that there is an ancient distinction between myth and reason, between mythos and logos, which has recently fallen into disfavour. And in his talk tonight, he has defended this distinction by suggesting it was out of the world of myth that philosophy emerged. He has argued that the pre-Socratics, the earliest philosophers in the Greek tradition, were heavily dependent upon both myth and religion for the questions they asked, the answers they gave, and the manner in which they spoke. But he has also insisted that their sayings bear witness to an important set of transitions. Firstly, they regarded each other's ideas as up for debate, beginning a tradition of critical discussion. Secondly, they began to offer natural rather than theological explanations refusing to attribute observable events to the actions of gods. Finally, they did not just present their own views, but began to argue for them. These three characteristics, Greg has argued, mark the emergence of philosophy from the world of myth and religion. Greg's lecture has taken us to another time and place, showing us how influential traditions of understanding and argument took shape and changed. In doing so, he has reminded all of us of the capacity of humanities scholarship to illuminate vital questions about human society, about how human communities think and communicate, how they make sense of the world, and what it is to be human. So thank you all for coming and joining in the celebration of Greg's promotion. He's demonstrated tonight, I think, very clearly the qualities that have seen him promoted. I'd like to invite you to join the academic party for refreshments in the staff club. But before doing so, can we join together to congratulate Greg again?